bit of a long road getting to this topic. I'm an economist. I started off studying what economists do: labor supply, retirement, wealth and savings. And health is obviously a really important factor in that. And it was really personal experiences of the financial and emotional consequences of people that live with this disease that led me to think harder about dementia as both an individual burden on families and also on society. So the first project that I looked at was costing. So it was about 10 years ago, what are the economic costs of dementia? And we started by quantifying primarily the medical care costs and the value of all the unpaid care that's provided by family. And what we found was striking. It was the combined cost of the disease was more than heart disease and cancer together. And then we looked to see, well, what is the future? What will these costs look like in the future for society? And the current state for treatments of dementia is that there are none. There's no way to prevent it. There's no way to cure it. And with the aging of the population, age being the largest risk factor for dementia, combining sort of those two factors, what we estimated was by 2050, the cost of dementia would be about 1.6 trillion US dollars just in the US alone. And as you know, this is a global issue. Every country across the world is struggling with the consequences of an aging population, and particularly the financial consequences of dementia. So I've really looked at how might we reduce the financial and health burden of dementia sort of across the continuum. So starting with prevention. So there's been a lot of studies on novel therapeutics where I have sort of focused on the prevention era, or the prevention factor is around repurposed drugs. So the drugs that we take for chronic conditions like diabetes, hypertension, hyperlipidemia. These are treatments that are very prevalent in the older population. And there's lots of hypotheses on how not only would they affect the vascular aspects of dementia, but also potentially reduce the risk through the pathology of Alzheimer's disease. But most of these studies are on animal models. Although the hypotheses sometimes are quite strong. So why not clinical trials? Well, there's very few clinical trials on these repurposed drugs because there really isn't much economic incentive to have these trials, which in order to find the result would take many, many years. So our approach has been using real-world data. So we can follow millions of people over a long period of time, and we can look in the real-world setting, the combination of drugs that they're taking and their risk of dementia as they age. So that's been really our approach to the prevention. Another important aspect of sort of thinking about reducing the financial burden is detecting it. So the current state tends to be dementia is detected late in the disease severity stage or goes undetected. So what does that mean? It means that people are not necessarily suited for clinical trial participation, so delaying the advancement of novel therapeutics. It means that they have trouble planning for their financial future or bringing together the supportive services that they're going to need. So part of my research has focused on how might we improve and increase cognitive assessment early, when symptoms are mild or moderate, so we can better detect dementia. And then on the other side of it, I've been really interested in thinking about how we can improve the quality of care for persons living with dementia and support their long-term care needs. So in the United States, we don't have a public or a universal long-term care system. So if you're very low income, you have some coverage through Medicaid, but for most Americans, they're relying on unpaid family members, and there are not only financial implications for the family of providing this care, but there are labor supply issues for the younger adult children who are providing this care. So I've really sort of thought about it from these, and my research group has thought about it from these kind of different aspects of the continuum of how we might approach the issues. That's a very good question. So the funding in the U.S. towards therapeutic treatments for Alzheimer's has increased dramatically over the last decade. And so the research around sort of how we understand the brain has advanced, I think, quite significantly, which is informing the trials for novel therapeutics. One of the biggest issues that we face in clinical trials is recruitment. So recruitment into trials has been harder and longer than recruitment to any other disease trials. And most fail out at some point and end up not eligible. The other issue that we face with clinical trials that will lead to a therapeutic is getting diversity in the trials themselves. So how do we engage with minoritized populations who are at higher risk of the disease? So there are, I think, really important advances that are going down that, and I think the economic incentives are there. There's a large and growing population of persons with this disease. It's really whether we can get the trials that we need, the participants in them, and that we can find the combination of drugs that can actually affect the pathology, which has been a real challenge in the scientific field. The long-term care needs of a person with dementia are intense. They increase as dementia severity increases, ending up with needing 24-hour full-time care. People with dementia on average live for 4 or 5 years, but there is a very skewed distribution of longevity. Some people live 10, 12 years with dementia. So you have a long period of time with intensive care. So how do you pay for that care? In the U.S., as I had mentioned, our healthcare system only pays through Medicaid for very low incomes. So most families need to have unpaid family caregivers or look to the labor force market. The workforce of caregivers for dementia specifically is not large enough to meet the demand, and particularly going forward into the future. There are issues with it being a low wage position, so there's a lot of turnover in the workforce. On the unpaid family member side, it's a very difficult job, even for a loved one, and the studies that we have suggest there are long-term health consequences as well as financial consequences on the caregiver. If it's an older spouse, they have their own health issues that they need to manage while they're trying to help their spouse. If it's an adult child, there's some very sort of key decisions that need to be made about staying in the labor force or leaving the labor force, which then, of course, leads to long-term financial implications for that adult child. And so you can see how not only does this impact the person living with dementia and their family, but there are these intergenerational consequences. So these wealth impacts spend your money down to provide the care, medical and long-term care. That's not wealth that's transferred to the adult child who is already potentially taking a large financial hit by leaving the labor force. So the implications for the well-being over the lifespan are large. So I think that what we need to really shift as a society is focusing on brain health like we do on other parts of our health. So start thinking about prevention early, start paying attention to assessment, cognitive assessment of yourself and your family. One of the, kind of untold stories of dementia is also the financial implications for older people who live with it when it goes undiagnosed. They're susceptible to financial scams. There's a lot of other negative implications that can happen. So if you even, I think that the future will be a future with a novel therapeutic. But until we get there, the best we can do is to think about brain health, think about what we can do to maintain brain health as we age. and pay attention to symptoms so that you can address them early in the stages. You can set up how you're going to be cared for. You can take care of your other health conditions so the dementia doesn't lead to unanticipated hospitalizations and other worse health outcomes. But my hope is that we are making good progress towards novel therapeutics, because in the end, that's what it's going to take to reduce the burden of this disease. The other factors can be helpful, but as we address these other health issues that are associated with Alzheimer's and dementia, we live longer. And as I started with, age is the strongest risk factor for dementia. So we need to address the disease head on.